very good evening, everyone. This is Suzanne Knabe-Nicole from Police Science Doctor, the online resource where you go if you want to find out how you can apply criminal science, investigative psychology, forensic psychology, criminology, and all that police sciencey stuff that is relevant to what our law enforcement practitioners do around the world into your everyday work. So today it's very exciting because I'm doing an interview with a wonderful Professor Gabrielle Salfati. She teaches at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, and she's one of the forefront runners of investigative psychology. I studied investigative psychology. I did my master's at the University of Liverpool in investigative psychology, and I did my PhD there as well in behavioral analysis for major crime investigations. We're going to speak to Gabrielle and find out what she's doing. She's also the director of the Investigative Psychology Research Center at the John Jay College, and we're going to ask her what that means now. So, Gabrielle, welcome very much. Thank you for coming and speaking to us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here. Very exciting.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about the investigative psychology unit where you are at the John Jay College?
Yes, absolutely. So I direct a research unit at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is in New York City. And that research unit is the Investigative Psychology Research Unit. So in that unit, we really focus on applying the science of investigative psychology to police investigations in many different ways. And we collaborate with police forces both here in the US and internationally. And of course, do the usual research, train students, but we also train investigators and analysts based on some of the latest science that we're doing, and we have quite a large unit there.
And what are your main fields of interest in what you're researching and what you're teaching?
Right. So the focus of what I do and sort of the focus of the unit is really how psychology can help police investigations. And my specific focus within that unit is, if you want, helping police by creating tools for police practice. My specific interest, my specific expertise is looking at the crime scene itself. So I look at how we understand how offenders behave at the crime scene and how we use that understanding through the lens of psychology to be able to understand the actions of the offender, and based on those actions, then apply that to different aspects of the criminal investigation. One of them being, as we're going to be talking about today, linking series, linking different crime scenes that an offender may engage in and trying to establish a series, but also the science of offender profiling, which is the science of trying to prioritize the most likely suspect based on how they acted at the crime scene.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about profiling then? Because it's something that a lot of people have heard. It's something that attracts a lot of people to the field. It's something that attracts a lot of screenwriters to, you know, for television and films. But what is the science behind it? Is there one, and what does it look like?
Absolutely. So I think that the reason why so many people find it interesting is because we have this sense that we're getting inside the offender's mind and we understand how they're thinking, and you know, that's sort of what they portray on TV. Mm-hmm. From the scientific perspective, the thing is, I mean, let me put that in a context. So most of us, when we speak to people and we get into a situation where we're trying to understand what happened, very often we get into a conversation where, you know, we infer what we think that person's intent was when they did an action. And these are people that we know, are in relationships with, that we've known for a long time. We have multiple examples of how they act. We get it wrong so often, even with people that we know. When we're looking at profiling from a scientific point of view, we try to, at least from the investigative psychology standpoint, we try to stray away from inferring intent, thinking about what's going on inside someone's mind, because it's so difficult to reach, and we can't really measure what goes on inside someone's mind in a useful way to police investigation. So we really focus on what an offender does at the crime scene. So what can we see that they do? But most importantly, not just what can we see, but of everything that they do, what is the important thing to focus on in order to be able to establish who we may be looking for? And the thing with profiling is, I think where there's some misunderstanding maybe, is that we don't aim to identify a specific person. We don't aim to say, this is, this individual who is guilty or not guilty. We don't really look at guilt. We look at more probabilities. So if someone engages in certain patterns of behaviors, the type of crime that they commit, the type of victim that they target, the type of weapon that they use, the individual actions that they engage in, how they approach the crime scene, how they leave the crime scene, we can use all of this to psychologically understand what was going on. Based on that psychological understanding, we then link that to the most likely type of person who would engage in those kinds of behaviors. We then use that information to prioritize the most likely suspect. And based on that, then, put that into a police investigation. So the idea is, if in a normal police investigation, you have very few resources, you're very often short of time. And so you want to streamline the process as much as possible. And if we can, instead of interview, let's say you had 100 suspects, instead of interviewing all 100 of them, which is going to delay the investigation, is going to take a lot of time, a lot of resources. If we can somehow say, based on what the offender did, they are probably this age, they have this type of criminal background, they live this far away from the crime scene, you're probably out of these 100, let's look at the ones who fit most likely that profile. Let's start there. It doesn't mean it's that person, but it means that it's a good starting point, and we're more likely to find them in that maybe top 10. And so we don't have to interview all 100. And that's sort of what profiling is, the idea that we link a type of person to a type of crime scene, and we use that to prioritize the type of suspects that you might want to prioritize in an investigation.
Yeah, exactly, because one way that I often describe it is that it just gives the investigation a starting point, because like you said earlier, it has to be useful to policing in some way, and we're not looking to identify a specific person. And in some very high profile and fantastic examples where, and I wrote about this in my PhD, but I've forgotten the name now, but it was a person who was writing these letters to their company, and they were profiling who that might be. And they said, oh, he's from this background, he's going to wear a buttoned up shirt. And when that person was arrested and then got dressed to go to the police station with the officers, he put on a buttoned up shirt. And whilst that is really fascinating, and the problem is it creates a halo effect. I think, oh my God, this is what the profilers were able to do. But it doesn't help the police, because how are you going to check in the database, right, who wears a buttoned up shirt? So it's, while it's fascinating afterwards, it's not really helpful. So really, investigative psychology is trying to assist police in the process. And like you say, it's just about what type of person is doing it. So, for example, if you've got a dead sheep in the field that was killed, are you going to, if you're going to assume it's going to be a wolf and maybe not a magpie, because people have seen that wolves do this kind of thing, whereas magpies are not. And this is not to paint wolves in a bad light. It's actually my favorite animal. But it's pattern recognition, and it just gives you a starting point. So let's look at where the wolves might be and where they might be coming from. And
exactly,
there's actually a reason to it, isn't it? And then the picture I had on my PhD, because I was actually looking at how the UK equivalents of profilers, the behavioral investigative advisors here, how they actually go about the process. So there was a looking glass looking at the offender's brain. But then I put a looking glass at the person who's looking at the offender's brain to find out, exactly how do they do it. And there's a method to it. And it's not this mysterious thing. And these are logical steps that they go through. So it's a really interesting field. And it has a bad reputation for being unscientific because of, how it started in the FBI. But then again, I don't know if you've watched the Mindhunter series, but after I watched that, of how it all started in the FBI, I have a newfound respect, because actually they created this thing in an environment where nothing like that existed. So, there was a lot of work involved. And even though the methodology is not accepted as good research methodology nowadays, back then they made something out of nothing at the time. Yeah. So, I have a lot more respect for that now. But it's a very fascinating field, and you can see I'm going off on tangents. What are the main advances in investigative psychology, would you say, in the recent years?
So I think, actually, that's a good starting point based on what you were just saying about how the field first started. When the field first started, like you say, how we understand it happened before. People were, if you want, profiling before that. But the FBI is really credited with having started modern profiling. And I think that they laid a really good groundwork there in terms of the idea that there's something about how people act that can help us understand who they may be. Now, very early on in the sort of crime analysis field in general, people who've written about it and who reviewed those early years, so we're talking about probably the 1980s, what people were finding was that people who were engaging in the process of criminal analysis or behavioral analysis applied to criminal investigations were really not using what we know about psychology in that process. And we've known a lot about behavior in general in psychology for a very long time. But they weren't using what we knew about behavior when they analyzed criminal behavior. And even people weren't using what we knew about criminal behavior as it was applied to the analysis of criminal sort of behavior. And because of that, a lot of questions were asked early on in the field in general about how reliable and valid this science was, or this process was, let's say. And that's really how investigative psychology got created. And it got created around 1990, as you know, by Professor David Cantor, who, you know, at the start of that questioning of, well, if we have a crime, how can we use psychology? What do we know about human and criminal behavior that we can apply to the crime scene in order to make it a scientific process, so that when people are talking about linking who a person may be based on what they do, how can we, I always say that it's the arrow between those two things, that is the science. What is the scientific process that we need to engage in to be able to make that valid so that it actually is supported, or, you know, basically creating the field of evidence-based policing or evidence-based analysis, anything evidence-based really. So I think that investigative psychology has created a way of thinking about the crime scene. It has really brought to the forefront how important it is to apply science, so that when we make certain assertions about who we're looking for or what kind of crime we're dealing with, we're basing that not on our opinion or even our experience, but we're basing it on numbers, on the science. If that science and those numbers then is the same as your experience, even better, because then you have the two sides sort of come together. And so I think that's the basis, is how we think about it. But what we have done is we have applied psychological techniques and ways of understanding behaviors in a systematic way. People always say, you're a profiler, you can go in and profile. And I did some profiling early on in my career. But here's the thing, when you're profiling, you're dealing with one case. And that might be, I'm an expert, I have the experience, I can do it. But if I can systematize that into a system and pull out what works, then I can train many crime analysts and investigators to do something that is already part of their job. And then we're really going to strengthen that police science a lot more. And that really is my focus. And I think where investigative psychology has been is creating the science so that we can train police officers to do it and crime analysts to do it, who are really the people who are on the scene at the end of the day. It's not like on TV where we psychologists tag along and, you know, we go and analyze crimes alongside police officers. It doesn't quite work like that in reality.
Yeah. And is that, so what kind of things do you teach then at the, do you have specific courses for looking at crime scenes to then find the starting point, as in, you know, prioritize and profile, or what is it you teach?
Yeah, so again, just to go back again to talk about TV, right? So how people most understand profile. And there's that series, Criminal Minds, and there's this poster. I always think it's a great poster, where you have the whole team there, and it says, you know, to catch a criminal, you need to think like one. And I think in investigative psychology, what we do is we try to stay away from that, because we really can't understand how other people think. And instead, we try to catch them by thinking like a psychologist. And so what we do in courses is we train people to think like a psychologist. Doesn't mean that you have to be a psychologist, but these methods that we've developed, we teach them to investigators. So at the university, I teach forensic psychologists at the graduate level and undergraduate level and PhD level to go into careers where they're either going to be practitioners and they're going to become investigators. So at John Jay College, we specialize in training people who go into various aspects of the criminal justice system. So they're either going to become practitioners, or they're going to become researchers or psychologists or clinicians, anything that sort of applies an understanding of behavior to whatever the job is. But what we're particularly specialized in is we actually train police officers and analysts for in the criminal justice system on these techniques. And so we run courses on this because, as you know, there are very few places in the world. It's a very new science. And there are very few places in the world where you can actually train in investigative psychology. And normally, if you want to train, you have to go and invest 2 years or a year of your life to do that. For police officers and analysts, that's not necessarily possible these days because it just doesn't work that way. So I had a lot of people contact me years ago saying, how do we access this? We want the knowledge. We want to apply this new science to the work that we're doing. And at the time, I then developed an online course, but specifically for investigators and people who are practicing in the field. And what we did was we took all the science and we translated it into things that can actually be applied immediately into someone's job, whatever that job is. And so we created the certificate course in investigative psychology. So that's one way of obviously training in this. But otherwise, working in collaboration with police organizations to develop their own systems so that they can train people within. So we have many ways of dealing with the process from many angles.
Mm-hmm. Let's just briefly focus your camera again. It's gone out of focus.
So this is there we go.
Perfect. Okay. So tell us about crime analysis. Crime linkage. Then, what is it, and what is the science behind that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think crime linkage is one of those things that was at the very forefront of profiling. So Egger, in 1984, I always like to use his quote. He was before investigative psychology, but he was doing a lot of work in trying to understand what we mean by linkage. So he was coming at it from a practice standpoint. And he coined a term called linkage blindness. And what he was essentially saying was that when the difficulty that police officers have or investigators in an investigation is being able to ascertain what is similar enough between two different crimes for us to be able to say that they're committed by the same person. And he sort of said that if two crimes look different and we're not focusing on the right things, we're not going to see it. And so the term linkage blindness. And because we're not going to see it, we're not going to link it to the investigation that we're engaged in, which has a number of different implications. One implication, obviously, is solvability. If we if we can't link crimes together, we're going to miss some and they're not going to get solved. But the other thing is, and this is the hugely important thing as part of the investigation, is by being able to link in all the different crimes, we get all that extra rich information that we can use to start building up a picture about who we're dealing with. And so the challenge early on was to try to understand what it is that people do from crime scene to crime scene over time that is similar. What do they do the same? Because the idea with linking is that we focus on what they do the same. Early on in the science or in the practice, people were linking based on what they thought people did the same. There was no science until 2005. The FBI actually had a symposium in 2005 where they invited a lot of us who were doing work in this area together, and people who were investigators, psychologists, scientists, lawyers, media people who had been involved in some way in an investigation. And they asked, it was a closed door thing, just to harness the knowledge. They said, we're several decades on. What do we know now? The one thing that we could all ascertain in 2005 is that we actually didn't have any science yet. And so it's very, very recent. And so the challenge has been to create this science, to understand how to link. But the first question that we had to ask is, well, we assume that people do the same thing at each crime scene. Is that actually correct? And so we did we did some baseline studies, first of all, to try to find out what do people actually do at each crime? And do they actually engage in the same behaviors? And so I did a study very early on with a student of mine, Alicia Bateman, and we actually reviewed everything that everybody had written. And we pulled out this sort of 6 general groups of behaviors that people had talked about that they thought were the most important to focus on when you link crimes. When we did a review, what we found is what people thought was the most important were the least reliable. And so now you have the difference between the practice and the science. So the numbers were showing that we weren't focusing on the right things. And that is why we had linkage blindness. And so our first challenge became, okay, so if what we think it is that the offender does is, the important thing, and that doesn't work, what does work? What should we focus on? And if you put that in the context of a crime analyst, so crime analysts very often work with large data sets of cases that they have, and they have about 300 plus indicators that they deal with, and they have to find similarities. If you have 300 indicators, you're going to find similarities. You're going to get a lot of false positives, and it's going to be a challenge. That's a lot for the human brain to deal with, and there's a lot of capacity for error there. What instead of looking at all those 300, what if we try to find out what are the top, let's say 10 things that are the most reliable to focus on? And if we focus on those 10 things, then we can link crime. So that is what we have been doing for the last 15 years, is trying to establish those top critical variables, critical actions that the offenders engage in order to link crimes. But what has been very interesting as we've been doing that is that we found some very surprising things that we didn't necessarily expect. And that answers a lot of those lingering questions that we had about why was it so difficult to link crimes together. So I think that's where we've been in the last 15 years in terms of, I'm going out of focus again, there we go. Where we've been in the last 15 years and what we've been working on. And then we've tried to refine that, because the ultimate point of investigative psychology and the ultimate point of the work that we do in the investigative psychology research unit is making sure that we have the science to help back the practice, and then training practitioners to use the science to essentially support the work that they do.
So can you tell us what are some of the most reliable variables to link on, and what are some of the least reliable variables to link on?
Sure. So let me start with what was one of the most unreliable ones. Very early on, when people first started talking about serial crime, there was sort of an idea that all serial crimes are sexual. And that sort of started the field off. And what we have found is that offenders don't always engage in sexual behaviors. And sometimes when they engage in sexual behaviors, it's not actually for sexual gratification, it's for other reasons like power or control or, dominance. And depending on how they engage in that, it comes out differently when we look at the crime. So one of the things that we found the most inconsistent and the most difficult things to use is actually the sexual nature of crimes. And so that was a big jump away from how the practice had been in those early years. And I'm not saying that sexual activity is not important, but how we were looking at the sexual activity was not the most useful way early on. And what we found was that it's not whether people were doing it or how it is, what kind of sexual activity were they engaging in. So that was one of the things that changed. What we found as well, the thing, and in one of the earliest studies that we did, in fact, on the first study in 2005, where that was really the first study that provided some kind of empirical basis for linking, where we actually got some numbers, we found that the thing that seemed to be one of the most important things is how people aim to control the crime scene, the patterns of control. And we found that it's not just whether they control or not, but it's how they control the victim, the crime scene. And that seemed to be something that we could really use in terms of linking crimes. But the challenge then became, what specific aspect of control do we need to focus on? So that's some of the things that we have looked at. The type of victim as well. But again, when people first looked at types of victims, they were looking at how do they look or who are they? But actually what we realized is that it's when we talk about type of victim, we need to move into much more of a psychological interpretation of a general pattern of victim versus is it a female with brown hair and blue eyes? Whereas when I hear people talk about linking, they're still very much focusing on what they look like versus what do they represent to the offender. And I think understanding that allowed us to bring in the psychology when we were understanding those behaviors. And that completely changed how we started seeing things. The other thing, that the main challenge, is that when you're looking at someone who's committing a crime over time, you have the element of time. People change over time. And each individual crime scene is different. Each victim is different. And so the offender has to adapt to each crime scene. So how do we get over that challenge of being able to find out what it is about what an offender does that is intrinsic to who they are versus something that could be influenced by the situation that they're in that impacts how something looks? So I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that an offender gags one victim and binds another. The behaviors we're focusing on here are completely different, right? They're doing something different to the victim at the crime scene. If we focus on that, we're not going to see a link between the two. But if we try to understand why they're doing this, not the motivation, but more the psychological approach to their behavior, it's all about control. They're binding a victim so that they don't run away, and they're gagging a victim so that they don't scream, ultimately because possibly they want to complete the crime and they want to control the victim in the crime scene. So so we're switching away from looking at that, what some people have called a signature, that, if you watch, Silence of the Lamb, iconic movie, right, where they put a butterfly in each mouth. That's like a signature, that individual, what Sherlock Holmes would call the clue. But if we move away from that and start looking at, well, can we understand behavior more as a psychological pattern, like you were talking about, right? Or what we call a psychological theme. And then that way, people can behave differently at each individual crime scene. But if they choose behaviors that all psychologically are similar, then we can start linking them. I don't know if that makes sense. So I always use the example I tend to use with people is, imagine you've got a new house, and when you get a new house, lots of things are going to go wrong. And so first thing that goes wrong, normally the plumbing. And it's one of those terrible things that nobody really wants to get involved in. So you call in the plumber. And so you try to explain to the plumber what's going on, etc. And, you say, that tubey thing and the watery bit. And, I just don't understand. And there's that lever, and they don't know what you're talking about. So they don't know what problem they're going to be dealing with when they get there. So they bring a toolbox with them. And inside that toolbox are lots of tools that are relevant for plumbing. They come, they look at the situation, they evaluate it, and they choose the most appropriate tool to deal with the plumbing. Then they repair your toilet and go away. The next day, new house, new thing goes wrong. This time it's the electricity. And so you call an electrician in, because you're not going to call a plumber for an electrical problem. So you call a different kind of work person in. And they bring different tools that are relevant for dealing with electricity. Again, they don't understand what you're saying on the phone because you don't know the proper terms. So they bring the whole toolkit. They arrive at your house, or if you think of it as the crime scene, they look at what is there, and then they pick a tool that is relevant to what they have to deal with. Now, if you put that in a criminal context, you have your plumbers, you have your electricians, but think of that now as criminal types. You have a controlling type and, let's say another type, and they come to the crime scene. They have their psychological tools but they will have their own tools because they are a specific type of person, and they will pick inside those tools, which are their behaviors, and they will apply those behaviors. So a person who has a subtype 1, like let's say someone who's controlling, is not going to use behaviors that are not about control. They're going to use those, but they're going to use different ones depending on the situation. That's how we then approach crime scene analysis.
I've read it in some articles. I don't know if they were maybe by David Kanter, whom you mentioned earlier, that rather than looking at individual behaviors, we need to look at the themes, because, like you say, the person is adapting. So, one behaviors that might have been mapped across some crimes are that they brought a restraint to the scene. So maybe they brought some rope so they could tie up the victim. But actually, at a different crime scene, there may be a cable lying around or a belt, so they use that. Now, it doesn't mean that they deviated from their behavior of wanting to tie the victim up, because here they brought something and they used what they brought. But if it's something available, then maybe you don't need to. So the overall theme is uses something to bind the victim, and you should not say, oh, they're not linked because there was a difference between this one and that one.
Exactly. And situations like that, at least they're tying someone up. But what if they do something completely different, but it still psychologically means the same? That's when it gets really difficult. And then when you add time in, people experiment early on, they develop over time, they change. All of those things will have an impact on how people behave over time. The impact is that actually people are a lot less consistent than we think they are, which makes the practice of linking crimes together extremely challenging for investigators. So anything that we can do to help train investigators with new tools, just like any tools that they use for investigations, bring them up to with the latest science that they can apply to the crime scene, that's going to be very useful. And that's sort of where, what investigative psychology is all about.
We had a question come in here. Muhammad Rahman, do you think pornography plays a big part in sexual orientated crimes?
Well, I think that it does, probably for some. I think the key thing, again, that we try to do in investigative psychology is that we try to understand how people behave. And then we look at how they behave differently. Let's say we're looking at different types of sexually oriented crimes. And then we look at who they are. You might find that a particular way of acting at the crime scene may be related to someone who uses pornography. Now, whether pornography causes sexual crimes is a different question, but this is what, in science we call the difference between a correlation and a causation. People often get those two things confused. So, for example, when we deal with a sexual crime, very often we hear about people having been sexually abused as a child, they come from troubled backgrounds, all of those things. And so we say, when we have sex offenders, they have this in their background. The conversation then gets flipped and people go, well, if you have been abused, you're going to go on and commit a sex crime. It doesn't work that way. So when we're looking at everybody who has been abused, who have had a difficult childhood, you're probably looking at 1 in 3 or 1 in 5 who has that in their background. Only a very tiny % of those people are going to go on and then abuse someone else. But when you look at those people and you look at their backgrounds, they all have sexual abuse. And so that's sort of the difference. So pornography is one of those things that we've talked a lot about in the field, because it's a very touchy subject. And people have said, if you watch pornography, does it cause crime? Well, it may, in some senses, just like watching violence may fuel you wanting to commit violence, but only for some of the offenders. For us as an investigative psychologist, what we're trying to do is understand differences between people. So to me, the key question is, if I look at a crime scene and I write a profile for the police, based on what they did, do I tell them that they're looking for someone who may have a large collection of pornography, who may have a previous criminal conviction for pornography, or underage pornography, particularly, because that's obviously what they would be convicted for. Looking at understanding how people commit sexual crimes differently allows me to know what kind of crime scene may have been committed by someone with that type of background versus someone who commits a sexual crime but is not likely to have that kind of background. Now, that is where, what profiling really is about, and where investigative psychology kind of brings in the science to be able to differentiate crime scenes into different types of actions, those tools that people are using, and then the different types of people that they are. Because the thing is, if everybody was the same, then profiling wouldn't work, because you'd look at a crime scene, you go, oh, it's a human being, it's a criminal. Well, that's not going to be very helpful. But if I can tell you that, well, he chose this type of victim in this type of location, this kind of weapon, and this is how he left the crime scene, we're probably looking at this type of offender because they are more likely to do this specific type of crime. So what we want to know is, how do different types of people target different victims, use different weapons, use different locations, and what kind of different background characteristics do they have? One of them would be pornography, but that wouldn't be for everyone.
And another question, there was mention of the show Mindhunters. Can the professor speak on how accurate the depiction of the use of psychology is in reality?
So I've not watched Mindhunter. My students tell me about Mindhunter all the time, though, because this is the newest, biggest show. But I do know that it's based in what the FBI were actually doing in the early years of profiling. So I know that it is based on real cases, and it's based on what they were actually doing at the time. So it is based on some facts, but it's televised. So obviously, like any process, any crime series on TV, you're getting, if you want, the Hollywood effect, where what makes good TV may not be the same thing as what is reality. The interesting thing is, and I always say this I always challenge people who come and work with me or study with me. I say, well, we hear about these terms that people talk about all the time. Someone is mission oriented, someone is organized or disorganized, or someone is a lust killer. We have these terms for people that come from TV. They use them in TV. But the thing is, it is actually based on people who've written papers using these terms. The question becomes are they actually useful to us? Is it based on science? A lot of the stuff that was done in the early years before investigative psychology was not based on science, or at least not science that stood up to testing. Some of it was based on statistics. And a lot of it is not actually allowing us to fully distinguish one type of person from another with those labels. Because one thing that a lot of those early ways of looking at behavior have in common is that they included, if you want, what defined that type of crime. So they included indicators that did not help us distinguish one crime scene from another, which is a problem, again, in profiling. And the reason why we couldn't distinguish one crime scene from another is because everybody engaged in that behavior. So we can't use it. So that was another challenge. What do we pick to use that not everybody does, but isn't so specific that only an individual does it, like the moth, the butterfly in someone's mouth, right? What are those behaviors in the middle that are the most useful, that can help us distinguish subtypes of people? And then we use that subtype to link series over time versus using the individual behavior, which we know changes over time.
So how would a practitioner then, for example, an investigator or a crime analyst, go about linking crimes then with these, sort of specific practical pieces of advice you could give?
So I think the first thing that we do when we train people is that often training focuses on the offender, what they do. But the first thing that we need to do is realize that we have actually 3 levels that we have to understand when we're analyzing a crime. Yes, do we need to understand the offender? Absolutely, we do. We also need to understand the crime scene and what happens and how best to analyze the behaviors at the crime scene and understand what is most important, what we in psychology call is the most salient feature of that crime scene to focus on. So those are those top 10 behaviors, as an example. The other element is us as people. We're human beings, and human beings all have the same brain, irrespective of what job we're in, whether we're criminal, we're not a criminal. We are driven by our cognition, by how our brain works and how our eyes perceives the world. As investigators and as analysts and as a psychologist, it is absolutely imperative that we understand how that influences our decision-making in terms of what we focus on at the crime scene. It doesn't mean that we're doing anything wrong. It's just the way our brain works. But being aware of how it influences us, then we can become aware of it. And I always say then you become an informed decision maker, so that when you're in a situation, you will know that certain thing will influence you. Certain things will, so we, for example, and an example to sort of contextualize this a little bit is our brain tends to focus on things that are vivid. When we're talking about something that is vivid, what we mean is that it sticks out. Things can stick out for many reasons. It can stick out because it's that clue. It's the thing that doesn't fit the rest. And so we focus on that. But psychology tells us that if you want to understand who's doing the crime, focus on what does fit. What are the elements that the crime scene has in common, not the thing that sticks out, because that's probably the thing that they did because something was different in that situation. But our brain will go to what sticks out. Our brain also goes to what is a bright color, what is a bright sound, what has an emotional impact on us. And if we then focus on those things, they may not be the most important ones to help us solve the crime. Understanding that our brain does this automatically is powerful, because it allows us, when we go to a crime scene, to see that there are things that are happening there that we know is going to influence our decision making. Is it going to go away? No, because this is just the way the brain works. You know, I've been in the field for over 25 years, and I still have those cognitive things happening, because that's just the way the brain works. But I'm aware of them. So then when I'm in that situation, I know, I see this thing here, and I know that I'm going to be influenced by that. So I'm going to take that into account in my decision making. So we train people on that. So those are the three different elements that we focus on: the decision maker themselves, the information that is the most relevant and impactful and useful in an investigation, and then understanding how that links in with the type of offender who may be engaging in those specific behaviors. So those are kinds of the things that we teach people when we're trying to really increase the tools that they have available to them. The idea is that all of this goes alongside normal police investigation training. It's not something separate. It's not something that solves all your problems. It's another tool in your tool belt. And together, that combination between experience and practice and the science is what is powerful.
And do you have like a step-by-step way for analysts and investigators of what behaviors or what themes they should be looking out for when they're going through an attempt of doing some crime linkage?
Yes and no. We do have specific things that we know are the most useful to focus on, those top 10. We have 15 years on, we have identified what is most useful to us to focus on and what is not. So we train people on that. So that's part of the step, is knowing where to look and what to look for, and knowing what is going to sidetrack us. So we train people on that. But I always say to people, so I teach people through the certificate courses that I run, who are investigators, analysts, but also many other professionals who engage in analysis of crime in many different contexts. So if you train someone on the behaviors that, let's say, are the most useful in sexual crimes or in homicides or in burglaries, they don't cross over. And so what is more important, and what I tend to train people on, is the process. What steps do you have to go through to make absolutely sure that you've covered your bases to get to where you need to be? So I always say to people, I'm going to train you on how to ask the right questions so that you can get the right answers. And that is a very specific process that we teach people. Science is organic. Psychology is organic. As the science moves on, the indicators, we refine them as we go along. So training people just on the indicators is very short term. Whereas if you train people how to think about crime, they can apply that over time to many different types of situations, in many different types of jobs, different types of crime. So it's a skill that moves with them. However, we also do train people, of course, in, let's say we have crime analysts that need to understand serial sex crimes, and they need to be trained on what should they focus on and what should they not focus on when they have their 300 pieces of information. Yes, we do, of course, then in those specific groups provide the latest science. But what I then tend to do is I say to people, stay in touch, because it's going to change. Good science changes. We always want to question our own analysis. Most people don't. They do one thing that stays the same. That's what happened in the early years of profiling. They never kind of evaluated it. And then when people did, 20 years had gone by and they realized it might not have been so, reliable. And we don't want to wait 20 years. So this has to be done all the time. So there's a little bit of both. Yes, we do teach people on indicators, but I always say to people, what's more important is how you think, because that you can walk away with that. And then if you know what to look for, you will become that informed decision maker. And then you can just go and find out about the indicators and stay up to date. But the most important thing is the thinking.
It's a bit like the give a woman a fish and she will eat for a day, teach her how to fish and she will eat for a lifetime. Exactly. And I changed it to woman on purpose.
Yeah.
There's a question here. Are there any introductory books that the professor can recommend to persons who are new to the field of investigative psychology?
Yes, I mean, I still think that the first book ever written in investigative psychology is the best, because particularly if you're not in, it depends on who you are. If you're not a scientist, if you're not a psychologist, and you're just interested in the field, I think the seminal first book that David Cantor ever wrote, called Criminal Shadows, is a fabulous book. He sort of goes through how he created the field of investigative psychology. He uses, thank you, yes, that one.
Bit of product placement there.
Yes. And he talks about case studies that he worked on, and he uses them to provide very clear example to illustrate the psychological concepts that are part of investigative psychology. And so I think it's a great book. And there's a UK version, 1994, and then there's an American version, 1995. They're both the same book, though. I think they're quite difficult to find now, though, online. But I would say that one is a great one. If you're someone who is looking for a little bit more of the science, there's a couple of books that I would probably recommend. Another one is, again, by David Cantor and his colleague Donna Youngs, who wrote a book called Investigative Psychology. Have you got that one, Suzanne?
Yes.
Thank you. So we have that one. That's a great book. It's 2009, so a lot of new stuff has happened since then. But in terms of, again, thinking about how we approach the crime scene, I think that is a really good textbook. There's another one as well done by Lawrence Allison that is the case, it's a blue one. Do you have that one? The case, it's much more about practice. Is the forensic case, yes, that the forensic psychologist casebook. So that one really puts the sort of the approach of investigative psychology within the practitioner field. I would say those three books as introductory texts are great. But if you really want to go in depth, more people have written, if you want, articles that are great. You can go on my website, and actually we can send you all of those if you're interested. You just go on there and, just click the button and we send it that. Another great book as well, if you're interested in crime linkage, is a book written by Craig Bennell and Jessica Woodhams, which is on crime linkage, which sort of gives you a chapter from different people who are doing work in the field of crime linkage. I think that's a great book as well. There's a number of different things out there, but I think the best works are still individual chapters and papers that have been written on different things. So I hope that's helpful.
And if I may just plug this one, that's also by Lawrence Allison and Lee Rainbow. That's the one that I'm in. I've got 2 book chapters in there. That's the only reason. And that's well, it is a very good book, but it's got me in there. So whilst I'm going through my my presentable book collection, I wanted to show you this as well. Another question here: can the professor provide information on how someone can enroll in her certificate courses?
Absolutely. So we run this course several times a year. It's a 6-week fully online course. So you can take it from anywhere in the world. We tend to adjust the times that we teach it based on who is in the course. I do very small cohorts because I personally teach the course and I like to have a connection with the people I teach. And so we have it as a conversation as well as information. The best way to get hold of it is to go to our website, and we have information there. So if you simply go to John Jay College of Criminal Justice and you go to the Investigative Psychology Research Unit, we have a page on there about professional training. But if you just put my name into Google and then just put professional training, the page will come up. And so we run this certificate course. It's aimed at practitioners specifically, or people with experience in the field, or people who are trying to switch into the field. And in 6 weeks, I pretty much do a full overview of what investigative psychology is. We cover profiling, we cover linkage, we cover crime scene classification, we cover decision-making, we cover how to focus on the most important behaviors. We focus on as a very, very intense course, but it's pretty much everything there is to know about investigative psychology. But what is nice about it is that every single time I teach it, I add something new because the science is constantly changing. So it's not one of those static courses. And every single time I always prioritize my certificate course and I always give them something that hasn't yet been published. So it's literally, they get it hot. It's not even hot off the press, it's before it even gets into press, so that they're really at the forefront. But I think what is really great about these courses is that it provides you a network of people. So people who come onto the courses are all investigators, all analysts, psychologists, or they're involved in some way in the field. But they come from many different backgrounds, many different countries, many different levels of experience, many different types of crimes. And they all have one thing in common, it's behavioral analysis. And what it does is that you're in a group of people who learn alongside you, and then you leave with an alumni of other people who understand investigative psychology and how you apply it to practice. I think that's what's really powerful. So I'm sure that we can probably put a link into, I don't know if we can put a link into.
Is it the Advanced Certificate in Criminal Investigation?
No, it's the Certificate in Investigative Psychology. So I can send I can certainly send a link on that to that you can put that up. I can find that now. But so that's one way of doing that that training.
Let me just see quickly. I think I've got it. So let me just put that here in the comments. So later after the interview, obviously keep paying attention to this one. You can just click on the link that I've just put in there. Yeah, it's the Investigative Psychology Certificate Program.
Yeah, so it's at John Jay, and if you just go John Jay College Professional Training IPRU, you'll find it. But I don't know if this site doesn't have a thing I can upload things. Or can I chat with the host? Can I put it in there?
You can put that into the private chat, and then I can put it into the comments. So yeah, good.
So yeah, so that's and we run that one, and the next cohort is going to be in the autumn and the fall if you're in America. And like I say, every cohort I tend to always make sure that we have people of different levels, different countries, and different areas of expertise, so that people can really see that it's not the specific crime that matters. What matters is how you approach the criminal investigation process. And I keep them small, and you pretty much will have everything that we have done in the IPRU for the last 20 years in that course. Mm-hmm. It's very exciting.
If you, it does sound amazing. Is this something that if I could, I would also take that program. It sounds like a lot of fun. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it to make a change in policing, what would that be?
Well, the magic wand thing, I mean, when we think about magic, we think of it being something external that we impose. And the same thing when we think about changing policing, we're looking at it very much from an external point of view. The way that I tend to approach my work in the field of investigative psychology and crime scene analysis is I see myself much more on the inside. And I don't try to change the police, I try to support the police. And I see that in terms of doing it as a collaboration. So very often the first thing that I do is, instead of looking at it from the outside and telling the police what I think needs to be changed, I have a conversation, we have a conversation. I say, well, what is it that you need? What are the questions that you have when you're facing difficulties in your practice? They are actually the expert here. They are the ones who have this question on a day-to-day basis. And so by asking them to verbalize what the question is, it gives me a context to base my work in. And then I do the science, and I very often in collaboration with the police, we then come up with the answers. So I would think about it more in terms of doing it as not so much as changing the police, but more in terms of how do we form these collaborations in order to identify the key questions that are the most relevant for us in terms of practice, and how do we then feed the science into that, so that we're really creating hand in hand evidence-based policing. And I very much see that as a collaboration. So that's sort of how I would answer that question. It's very much from, how can I support the police? I can support the police by finding out what is relevant to them, applying the science, connecting the two, and then training the police to help support their jobs, to do them better, faster with the limited resources that they often have.
Mm-hmm. And if people only were to take away one point or one bit of information from this interview today, what would you want that one bit to be?
I think really, I'm going to put it in the context of us doing this interview today, and you doing what you do and me doing what I do. And again, it's a collaboration. I think what we have here today is a fantastic opportunity. And I think the one thing that I would want people to walk away with is stay up to date, stay informed with what's going on. Use all these amazing resources that are provided to help you stay up to date. The most basic one is what we're doing here today. It's a webinar. They're free. Suzanne does great ones. I've watched a lot of them. I show them to my students because it's a great opportunity to link in with people who are, at the forefront of what they're doing. And I think you're doing a fantastic job of just pulling people in to really tell other people what's going on in the policing field. And so I think that would be the one key takeaway: stay updated. And you can do this in many different ways, depending on who you are, what your needs are, and what you're interested in, and also at the level that you want to do this. Like I said, the most basic thing is do webinars or podcasts. There are numerous ones out there that I think are great that I would recommend. If you wanted to take it one notch up, what I would say, the main thing I would, again, stay up to date by engaging in something that is going to give you skills, that is going to add to your practice, to allow you to engage in your job with the most up-to-date information, such as the certificate I run, but there are other training courses out there as well. It all depends on, the certificate is great if you want to know about investigative psychology, crime scenes, profiling, linking serial crimes. But if you're interested in another area of policing, seek out the key centers where you have the experts teaching these certificate courses, not just people who are running certificates, because a lot of people run certificates, but seek out the key people and see what do they run. And then you can do entry-level certificates. You don't need to go and do a degree. If you wanted to go into a degree, obviously that's the next step up. And then I think the next level of engagement, if you really want to do this whole thing about staying up to date with what's going on, is engage, to make that link between, if you're a scientist, engage with practice. If you're practitioners, engage with science. Because ultimately, we can't look in from the outside, and it's that change thing again. We can't change things from the outside. We need to do it from the inside, and we need to do it together. Both sides, we've often thought of them as two separate sides, and always talking about which one's better. It doesn't work that way. We're good when we're together. You bring science together with practice, you have the best bits together, and we become bigger than just the pieces. And so I think that would be my biggest takeaway: stay up to date to inform your practice, and do it at the level where you are right now, depending on who you are and what you need. But there are many, many possibilities out there, because it's a fast-moving science. It's exciting what's going on, and you get energized when you get involved. What I see happening in my certificate courses over and over again, I have practitioners coming in who just want information. By the end of it, they want to do the work themselves, which is fantastic, because then they go out into the world and do the work. And then we're expanding the science, and everybody basically will have access to more information that way, which is exactly what should be happening when we're combining science with practice. So that, I think, would be probably the main takeaway thing.
Well, one of my contributions to helping people stay up to date is the police science snippets that I email out. So I've got a free email list. You can subscribe to that by going to policesciencedoctor.com and just put your information into the registration form that pops up, or you find it at the bottom of every page. And every Tuesday I send out the police science snippets. So it's three bits of information that I think are practical and applicable by law enforcement practitioners. And they have these three snippets, and it's nothing theoretical, it's nothing very abstract, it's something very practical. So that's one of the ways you could stay up to date. Just get yourself onto the free email list. And also, like Gabrielle mentioned, my events. Thank you very much for your kind words. So the events that I put together where I don't publish my own content. I take other people's research and I put it out there because people need to know about it. So I'm a conduit through which everything flows. And yeah, so that's what I do to help you stay up to date. And obviously there's other ways as well, but I agree, it is very important. Yeah, well, Professor Gabrielle Salfati, thank you very much for your time this evening. It was great to have you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yes, it was a great, and again, thank you for putting these things together. I think it's so important for people to be able to access things. And I do want to plug your website again, because you are really putting out a lot of good information out there. So please, everybody, have a look. And thank you so much again for inviting me. And thank you so much for everybody who participated today and who are watching this podcast afterwards, this webinar afterwards. And I hope you took something away from it.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get access to each episode's transcript with key learning points, timestamps, and references if you get yourself onto my mailing list. Just go to the main website on policesciencedoctor.com, and on the bottom of each page you will find a sign-up form for notifications of new content. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address, and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to let you know about new content and for you to get access to all the transcripts.